Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Miesbauer, Content Manager at Agiloft. Welcome to today's training webinar titled Using and Modifying the Approvals Table, hosted by Agiloft implementer Ryan Simmons. Today's training will explain the more advanced concepts of using and modifying the approvals table to improve your contract workflows. This spring we hosted a training on the basic concepts of Agiloft approvals, and we'll send a link to that training along with this recording in a recap email. Today's presentation will be about 33 minutes, followed by a live Q&A with Ryan. You can submit your questions in the appropriate window in the Zoom platform at any time during the presentation. It takes just about a minute to queue up the video, so please bear with us as we do that.
My name is Ryan Simmons, and I will be guiding you through using and modifying the approvals table. This is an advanced seminar. Previously, we covered basics, such as how to manage approvals from a contract, creating ad hoc approvals, the basics of working with the approval record, working with approval workflows and approval templates, and a couple of other common updates. That recording is available if you would like to view it. During today's call, we will use more complex and powerful functionality such as updating rules, adding new fields, running linked record actions, building complex searches, and working with field visibilities. However, everyone can take something away from this call regardless of their level of expertise with Agiloft. Feel free to reach out for help bringing these ideas into your own business processes and knowledge bases. After the call, I will even provide a spec if you would like to build some of this functionality out yourself. On the agenda for today, we will work with repeating reminders, like sending out reminders every other day. We will go over the backup person field, which you may have seen in employee records. We will cover escalating approvals based on the limits of employees. You will allow approvers to require changes from the contract requester, legal representative, or someone else from the contract. We will go over strategies for deduplication, so we don't have one person with multiple approvals for one contract. Then we will cover a variety of other customizations. These require understanding the fundamentals of approvals. This includes field visibilities and how approvals move the contracts from pending approval to the approved status. Let's start with repeating reminders. Reminders ensure nothing slips through the cracks. In the approvals table, create the approval reminder date field. This will be the date that the reminder sends out. We can send a reminder out at any interval, such as every day, every other day, etc. More likely than not, we will stick with a standard period of time, such as every 2 business days. If you would like to control this on a contract by contract basis, create the approval reminder frequency field. This is the optional field that we have on here. I recommend against setting this because it's just one more thing to manage, but it is something to consider. We are going to update the existing edit rule in the approvals table. When the status moves to pending approval, an update action will set the approval reminder date to today plus 2 business days. If you would like the reminder to send out more or less frequently, then of course increase or decrease that number too. If you would like to use the approval reminder frequency field that we were talking about earlier, then use that variable instead of the hard-coded number. Now our approval reminder dates will be set whenever the contract moves to the pending approval status. Next, we will create a new time-based rule called daily check for approval reminder date. This rule will run every day. Sometime in the morning is probably the best choice. The rule will run on every pending approval that has the approval reminder date equal to today. There are two actions that will run. One, it will send the email to the approver or the approval team. And the second one is it will update the approval reminder date. This is the same update action from our edit rule. This is also a good place to consider escalating approvals to the approver's manager or the backup person, which we will talk about a little bit more in the next couple of slides. All right, let's go into Agiloft and see what repeating reminders looks like. Here we are looking at a contracts record with the approval reminder frequency set to 3 days. This is the optional field that we are going to use to update the approval reminder date. If you would like to always send a reminder out every 2 days, just use 2 days in the rule and we will not worry about this field. When we open the approval record, you can see the approval reminder date is null, and that will change when we change the status from queued to pending approval. And now the approval reminder date set for 3 days in the future. So let's take a look at the rule that sets the approval reminder date. In the edit rule, all contract approval edit actions, web and API, we will navigate to the actions tab. Let's edit the only action in this rule and take a look at what happens when the status changes from any value to pending approval. The action we are interested in is update approval reminder date from now. Let's take a look at the action, and you can see that it simply takes now and adds the variable approval reminder frequency in business days. This variable was set in the contract record earlier. However, feel free to use a number and hard code it into this formula. Next, a time-based rule runs to check the approval reminder dates and send out the notifications. This runs at selected intervals and uses a search to make sure the records are pending approval and the approval reminder date is today. The timing of this rule dictates when the email notifications send out, so it's good to apply this rule every day around 9 in the morning or another convenient time. Since I don't have a license on this demo knowledge base, I can only run this every 2 days. There are 2 actions in this rule. The first sends the appropriate approval reminder based on whether the approval is assigned to an approver or an approval team. The second is the same action that we were looking at before that sets the approval reminder date. That is all it takes to get this functionality off the ground. We will use a similar time-based rule in field to escalate approvals to the manager or backup person. Next, we will look at working with backup people. There are a few different ways to use this functionality. A user may no longer be with the company. They may be temporarily out of the office. Or we might just want to escalate an overdue approval. An employee's backup person, manager, and work status can be set in the employee's record. I like to change the option on vacation to not working. I also like to add no longer with the company as an option. This lets me know if somebody is not working temporarily or permanently. On the Jobs tab, we can select the backup person and the manager. In the Approvals table, we are going to update the link to selected fields from the approval to the approver. Be sure to add the approver's work status, the backup person, and any manager information that you would like to include. Each use case provides a different plan of action. When somebody leaves the company, I recommend actually adding a button called Deactivate User. Not only will this button do things like remove their group's teams and update their password so they can't log in anymore. But you can decide if it should reassign any contracts or approvals. Another choice is to reassign approvals if somebody is out of office. We strongly recommend against doing this unless someone is updating the work status for all users on a regular basis, probably a daily basis. Additionally, this takes a little bit of work to update the edit rule in several places, so it's a little bit more time intensive to set up and to maintain. Finally, a timely escalation is extremely similar to the repeating reminder functionality we already built out. That's simply adding a date field to the approval records, updating it the same way that you update the date to send the next reminder, and then either reassigning the approval record or simply sending out a notification with a time-based rule. This is extremely similar to functionality that we have already set up. Let's jump into Agiloft and see this functionality in action. I created a button called Deactivate User. When it's clicked, it will strip out the groups, teams, primary teams, and you can do a lot more with this functionality. However, for the sake of approvals, we are going to look at the linked record action that runs when this button is clicked. In this linked record action, which I'm calling reassign approvals, we are going to select the approvals related table at the bottom, and we are going to filter these approvals only to use those that are queued or pending approval, so we do not upset the audit trail. The update action simply updates the approver ID with the backup person ID from the approver, which we can find in the parent fields section. And that is all it takes to deactivate a user and reassign their approvals. Next, we are going to assign to a backup person when the employee is temporarily out of office. Let's update the work status and the backup person. And that's all we need to do on the front end. We're going to take a look at what it takes to build out this functionality. If you don't get it, that's okay. Feel free to ask questions at the end. We will be providing a spec, and you can reach out if you need help implementing this into your KB. Now let's take a look at the link to selected fields from approvals to approver, and we can take a look and see that the backup person, manager, work status are all there. And finally, we're going to look at the edit rule in the approvals table. Basically, anytime we see notifications sending to the approver, it lets us know that we need to either email the backup person or reassign the approval altogether, depending on what you want to do. You absolutely must do this when the status changes to pending approval and this sends out a notification. You don't necessarily need to do this when the status changes to not needed or another status like that. For timely escalations, we are really just going to look at the rule that we already created for daily reminders. Basically, everything here will stay the same when you copy this rule, except it'll be based off of a new date field. And under selected actions, of course, we are going to either reassign the approval or send the notifications to the correct person or people. Those are the options for using the backup person and manager fields as they pertain to approvers. With some planning and forethought, you can make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. Next, we are going to look at approver thresholds. With this functionality, if the dollar value for a contract exceeds the approver's threshold, the approval is assigned to their manager. If the dollar amount exceeds the manager's threshold, the approval escalates once again. The approval continues to escalate until somebody with a high enough threshold is able to approve. Let's take a look at an example where Roy manages two employees, Kendall and Marshall. Roy's approval limit is 500,000. Kendall's approval limit threshold is 200,000. And Marcus's approval limit is 100,000. If the contract amount is 150,000 and Kendall is the original approver, the approval does not escalate to Roy. If Marcus is the original approver, the approval does escalate to Roy. So essentially what we need to do is set the range for Roy. The lower limit is going to be the approval limit of the managed employee, which can change from approval to approval. The upper limit is going to be Roy's approval limit threshold. So we added a new edit rule in the employee table. This rule is triggered when the escalated approval ID is updated and is not blank. The first action for this rule is to update the approval limit links and the escalated approval ID in the manager record. This creates the relationship between the manager and the managed employee and the manager and the approval in question. This also triggers the rule to run again on the manager's record, which will continue to trigger and trigger. So it essentially sends this information all the way to the top of the management chain. Then we have an if-then-else action that will assign the person as the approver if necessary. It checks the escalated approval contract amount against the approval limit and the approval limit of the managed employee. So in our example we were looking at before, this action evaluates whether the contract amount is greater than Kendall's approval limit or Marcus's approval limit and less than Roy's approval limit. Finally, when that's done, we just clear out the approval limit linked fields. I added approval limits to a couple of employees. You can see System has the lowest approval limit of 10,000. When we go to the Jobs tab for System, we can see System's manager is Shakespeare. When we pull up Shakespeare's Job tab, we can see the manager is Chuck Eisner. Let's look at an approval for a $15,000 contract. When we move the status to pending approval, that's when I designed the system to run this action, and that will change the approver from System to William Shakespeare. If we run this again and we change the contract amount, we can see that it assigns to Chuck Eisner. So it continues to work its way up the ladder until it finds somebody who can approve this contract. And that sums up the approver threshold functionality. Next, we are going to look at approvers routing backwards. This gives approvers the ability to require changes from an individual from the contract. Remember, providing more control of required changes functionality may not always be a good thing, since it is an extra piece for your users to worry about or possibly mess up. But it can save a lot of time, since the approvers will direct the questions to the correct people right away, cutting out the middleman. This setup is actually pretty simple. The approver will select the person from the contract to require changes from, and it will send them a notification. We don't have any extra actions, nothing happening with the contract itself, although you could certainly add to this functionality to do so. And then there's some functionality that you can add to the resubmission for approval. Maybe you want to track a couple of key fields that have changed, or go through the entire approvals process again. or maybe you just want to send it back to that one approval that requires changes. This is certainly part of the process that you want to consider when we add to this functionality. You may have something in place now that goes through your contract managers. This sort of bypasses it because we're going directly from the approver to whoever they're selecting. So it's just something to consider. In Agiloft, we just update the required changes from person field. These are replacement variables that we're looking at, and required changes as normal, and that person receives a notification. Moving along, we are going to look at deduplication of approvals. The goal is to stop users from getting multiple approvals for one contract. This build out is going to move the approval with the lowest step number to the not needed status. However, that's really easy to flip around if you want to move a different approval to the not needed status. The main action will be part of the create rule in approvals. So this will be an if then else action that only runs when there is an approver. So when the approver ID is not null. Then we will use a linked record action that goes from the approval to the contract ID and then back down to all of the approvals. There is a filter, so we only select approvals that match on approver that have a lower step number or equal to, you can do. And then the status is queued. I also like to make sure that the actual record IDs don't match up to prevent an approval record from canceling itself. And then we are going to move any of those approvals to the not needed status. And you can add a similar action to the edit rule just to make sure that you account for any changes that happen between creation of approvals and launching of approvals, like rechecking conditions or just manual updates. Since this functionality just changes the status of an approval, we're going to move directly on to other customizations. To go through these other customizations, the first thing that we need to understand are the fundamentals of how approvals actually work. The first piece we are going to look at are choice fields that help with visibilities and filters. One includes the related to field. This will display different fields based off of the table selected. So we might have contracts, we might have projects, there could be a number of different tables selected, and that controls which buttons appear, it controls whether contract details appear, and much more. We will look at choice fields that control action buttons that look similar but may trigger different actions. We will look at choice fields that can change the timing of approvals. Additionally, these choice fields can apply filters to approvals correctly. For example, if we are looking at a contract and its approvals, and some approvals have sub-approvals, which are basically approvals within approvals, we want to separate those out from our regular approvals. So when we use choice fields, it allows us to use filters and it allows us a clean interface. The other basic of approvals to go through is how approvals actually mark the contract as approved. In a contract, there are two fields. One is the number of approvals completed, the other number of approvals needed. When these equal each other, the contract moves from pending approval to approved. There are variations of this, but the fundamentals are checking these calculations on multiple linked fields to make sure that every approval is completed that needs to be completed, and that there were approvals needed in the first place. We are going to combine these basics with approval timing functionality. With a choice field, we are going to separate the initial approvals from the final approvals. That will allow us to view these records in different places from the contract. It also allows us to sort approvals when we are calculating the number of approvals completed and the number of approvals needed. Notice in Agiloft, when we change related to change request information appears. And when we change it back to contracts, our contract details appear. Also notice the approval type is final. This is why this approval record is in the bottom related table. We have two initial approvals, both are approved. Notice the number of initial approvals needed and number of initial approvals completed are both 2. Whereas for our final approvals, we have 1 approved and 1 pending approval, which is why our number of approvals needed is 2, while number of approvals completed is just 1. We are going to use basically the same functionality to work with subject matter experts. For SMEs, instead of approving, requiring changes, and having a little bit more control there, we are only allowing the approver to put in some approval notes and submit a response. To do this, I updated the contract approval type field that we were already using. When I toggle back and forth between SME and final, we can see that the buttons at the top change. This next piece is a little bit more advanced. This is approvals within approvals. You may have an approver who, before they can make their decision, they need to consult 1, 2, or as many people as necessary. This will work very similar to how we assign approvals from an approval template or from an approval record in general. The approver is going to select the team and the approver, as always. A background field is going to handle the visibility for these approvals, and that will allow us to filter out these sub-approvals, which is what I'm going to call them, from our related table in the contracts record. We'll add a couple of fields, a conversion action, and mimic functionality from other tables in the approvals table. So as I said earlier, the way that we assign approvals is based off of the team, and then that allows you to select an approver. We have a very similar linked set to the approver and team here as well. And then we will click the Add Approvers button. This button converts the new approval record that we can see at the bottom, clears out the new approval team and new approver. When we open up the approval record, we can see it gives us some information here. So the approval title is a formula that gets set that is customizable. The status is already pending approval. That might not be what we want. We might want to make it queued. The step number is blank. Once again, that might be something that you want to set. But the big things are the approval team, the approver, and the contract approval type are all set correctly. And of course, that choice field, the contract approval type, is sub-approval, which makes sure it shows up correctly in our related tables and it shows up correctly in our calculations. There are 2 ways that we can set these fields. The first part is going to be the conversion. So this pushes over the approval ID into the source approval ID field, which is very important. It pushes over the assigned person and team. And we can use this formula functionality to set the status and the approval title as well. We can also update the create rule to run a few actions or send notifications. All we need to do there is create an if statement to check if the source approval ID is not null. This is the important field that we map over in our conversion And below there, you can add any update actions or notifications. Once again, we're working rather quickly through these items because we will be providing a spec later if you would like to take some time to build this out on your own. This is more about understanding the fundamentals of approvals, getting some ideas from this PowerPoint, and coming up with some ideas of your own that might fit your process better. Maybe you don't use approvals for contracts, but you want to use them for other tables. Once again, this is functionality that we already have in the system, and we can mimic if we add custom tables of our own. We already have functionality in the system that relates approvals to documents and to change requests. We can see that those relevant fields will appear based off of the related to section that we click. They have their own set of edit rules. So we really just want to copy that into any new table that you may be adding to the system. We need to make some updates to replacement variables and a couple of other fields. And then, of course, there are some conversions updates that we want to see in the system as well. Like we talked about before when we change a contract approval type, if we change the related to fields, we can see information on the approval record change. If we take a look at the approvals tables set of rules, we can see create and edit rules for documents, contracts, change requests. I recommend adding a create and edit rule for a new table. One of the other tables in the out-of-the-box system that uses approvals is the documents table. In the edit rule that moves the document to approved, the search is going to check and see that the total number still awaiting approval is 0, and it checks that there are approvals in the first place. This kind of search should look rather familiar for what we see in contracts. And this is the search that we can apply to any other table that you're building out approvals for. One thing that is different is when I click submit approval, it is only going to generate an approval for the assigned person. We can see when I click on that button, it is going to run a linked record action, and it is going to set the latest document ID in the person's record. This is going to trigger a rule in the employee record. You can take a look at the rule in the employee table, check to see the condition it runs when that latest document ID field changes. And it has its own conversion from the employee record, which is different from how our contract approvals work. Our contract approvals use approval templates. The reason I'm bringing up this difference is to show that there are other possibilities for other tables. You might want to generate your approvals through an employee record. You may want to generate approvals through an approval matrix record. So the system is flexible enough to work with different tables and handle different use cases. But before you voyage off and do this on your own, be sure to check out how those calculations on multiple linked records work, where we have the total number of approvals and the actual completed approvals. And be sure to work with the related to choice field or other choice fields to handle field visibilities and to enhance your filters. And that wraps up our advanced approvals seminar. We will be having a Q&A after this. Remember, we will be providing a spec for how to build some of these out. We do have a basics approvals seminar online, as well as a lot of training. I hope that you have a better idea of how robust the approvals functionality is, and I want to thank you for watching.
All right, now let's open it up for Q&A with Ryan. I'll start with the one we always get. Will the recording and slides be available after the webinar? Yes, we'll post this edited version under events and webinars on our webpage in about 24 to 48 hours, and we'll also send you a link to view that along with that spec sheet and the basic training on the approvals table and a recap email. Great. I see one here for you, Ryan. How would I implement an approval matrix? Why use approver thresholds instead of conditional approval templates?
Great. These are great questions because they work with each other. So what I found really interesting building out the approval threshold functionality is it puts the criteria for assigning an approval in a record on another table. So you can have somebody go through the people table and update the approval limits. And this is something that you can do with an approval matrix is you'll build out this table and you can put the conditions in the approval matrix. You might be able to put approval limits or something along those lines. And the approval template record will kind of queue the approval matrix, and within the approval matrix table, it'll take a look at the threshold, it'll take a look at all of the criteria, decide if we need to generate an approval or not. So they're pretty. If you're going to build out an approval matrix, I would take a look at how approvals in other tables work and how the approval templates functionality works.
Perfect. Yeah. Another question: what are some of the ways people resubmit approvals?
Great. So we talked about requesting changes from an approval, and one of the things that we want to do with that is make the person take a look at the contract and maybe be able to make an edit and resubmit it. And for the most part, we just submit it to the approval that required changes in the first place. However, something I've seen people do is create a choice field, and the choice field will track if anything in the contract changed, like the contract amount, the term, or some, just a handful of really important fields. And so if any of those change in an edit rule, it'll update the choice field. And then when you click resubmit, it will go back to the beginning of the approval process if one of the key fields changed. If none of the key fields change, then it will go to the approval that is in question. So there are certainly different ways that you can resubmit for an approval that we just didn't have time to get to during today's call.
Perfect. And yeah, just bringing back a question that was asked during the presentation. All of what was the question? Is all this functionality included within the regular Agiloft platform? And does it require extra costs? The answer is yes, it is included. I don't know if you want to expand on that a little more, Ryan.
Sure. I built out all of this functionality along with another implementer in an out-of-the-box system, just like you would have. Of course, we added a lot of different fields and functionality in there, but we did not have to get a different license. We used the same knowledge base that you get when you sign up with Agiloft.
And I think that's kind of the proof of the flexibility of the platform, and that we want to be able to offer you as many chances to learn how to use the flexible platform and to be able to configure your system even in a more advanced way. So Ryan, where would we kind of instruct people to go if they get this training, they get through this? I mean, what's the next steps to kind of improve their skills with Agiloft?
So the way that I learned this was working with a free KB, just going to Agiloft Sales and getting my own KB and building this out. Maybe you have a test environment where you can build these things out. But we're going to be sending out a spec that I've been working on that goes through a lot of these items So this is a good video to keep in your back pocket. You can come back to it later on if you didn't get something that's completely expected. So you can always come back to it later on. And then you'll have the spec to work with as well. So you'll be able to actually see the nuts and bolts, all the fields that you need to build, all of the actions and rules and everything. So those are certainly good ways to get started.
Great. And yeah, if you're not aware of the wiki.agiloft.com, our help wiki also has some materials, and we have a full administrator training for those that are new to the platform as well. So if we don't have any other questions, I'll say thanks again to Ryan for your time producing this training. I know it was really helpful and very thorough. And if you've enjoyed this session, check out our webinar series on our website at agiloft.com. We'll be back in July with a biotech customer roundtable and then a webinar with Adobe Sign. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.